Good morning, everybody. I'm Carolyn from Titan, and welcome to James McNeillie, who is the Acting Regional Director for Ofsted. And thank you, James. We've been trying to help you meet some of our head teachers probably now for about 9 months, but thank you for making the time. We are expecting a few more, so hopefully they'll come into the session. But lovely to see you. Thank you, James. And I shall hand over to you.
Great, thanks. So I think there are some slides which will be helpful just as a prompt, and we'll send those out afterwards as well. What I thought I'd do this morning is just sort of to reiterate what we're doing around our interim visits this term, to share with you some sort of key findings if you haven't had a chance to look at them from the first 120 odd schools that we visited earlier in September, and then a chance for colleagues to ask me any questions that they want to ask as well. Really happy to take any questions at the end. Okay,
Tried, there we go.
That's okay. So just in terms of, some of you may have seen our operational note that we published at the beginning of September, which outlined the purpose of the visits, the format of them, and what we were going to do as a result. And what I've tried to do in this morning's presentation, and hopefully in any questions, is really summarize that for you, because I appreciate how busy you are. So we're on the right slide now, which is fantastic. Plans for schools, thank you. So we started our interim visits on the 28th of September. That was after doing about 120, I think it was, pilot visits, including in West Midlands and indeed including in Birmingham, which was really helpful to us in testing out what it is that we were aiming to do and how we were going to do it. I think one of the things I want to really emphasize is that on these visits during this term, we're not using the education inspection framework or the school inspection handbook. So some colleagues will be familiar with both of those, the framework and the handbook, which is what we would be doing if we were inspecting schools. So we're not using those at all. In terms of if you want any information, there is the operational note, and that's easy to find. It's easier to just Google it rather than trying to find it on the .gov website, I have to say. And I say that outlines all of the aspects that I'm going to cover this morning as well. We will carry out some inspections as opposed to interim visits, but those will only be where we've got significant concerns about safeguarding, or there's been concerns raised to us about a serious breakdown in leadership and management. We have carried out a couple of those since the beginning of term, which were focused on safeguarding, and we were right, absolutely right, to do those visits based on the outcomes that we found. But we are hoping we're not going to have to do very many of those. You'll be aware that routine inspections were suspended at the beginning of the pandemic. We do intend to return to inspection activity in January, but obviously, given what's happened over the last few weeks, we are keeping that absolutely under review, and in terms of what we're finding from our interim visits, and ultimately that will be a decision in consultation with the Secretary of State about what our plans are from January onwards. In terms of this term, we're visiting a sample of schools across all grades, all Ofsted grades, including those schools that haven't yet been inspected, so the new schools. We'll take a sample of those. We are visiting all schools that are currently judged inadequate, but there is also a representative sample of outstanding good RI, and as I said, those schools that haven't yet been visited. We're giving up to 1 day's notice, and I just want to talk a little bit about that, I guess, at this point. So phone call made about 10 o'clock in the morning before the visit, and that telephone call is a very short one. The ones that I've led, it's only been about 20 minutes. It's not about, what are you doing around your curriculum? What are you doing about behaviour? All of that kind of thing that we might have done on an inspection. It's very much focused on practicality. So making arrangements for our visit to get a sense of where the school is in terms of the issues that are the school is currently facing. What's the situation with staff on site and pupils on site? I think it's worth mentioning here about if we do call a school and they are dealing with an immediate issue in relation to COVID-19, then schools will probably recommend that school to request a deferral, because head teachers and senior leaders need to focus on the immediate issues there. We have been to some schools where, in fact, we turned up at one this week after agreeing that we would be there, and like a colleague's mentioned this morning already, there was a positive case, and so we withdrew from that visit immediately, because the head teacher needed to focus on what she needed to focus on at that time. So that conversation, as I say, pretty brief. It's about organisational aspects, about how the day is going to look, and any arrangements that need to be made, and also about making sure that we are aware of what your expectations are about visitors in your school, making sure that we follow your expectations, and also that the arrangements that are made are in line with government guidance, public health, and so on and so forth. We'll be publishing a short letter after each visit to each school, which summarises key facts, as it says on the slide there. I'll talk in a bit more detail about that towards the end of this particular session. And we have published the first batch of those letters, which some colleagues may have seen. And I think they came out on Friday or Monday. During these visits, we're not going to be judging schools on their response to COVID-19 during the spring and summer term. I'm sure you'll want to talk to us about some things that happened and some things that you did, because that's about the context of your school. We're very happy to hear that. And in fact, that will be useful to inform some of the information that we're gathering. But what we're not doing, as it says in that final bullet point there, is providing any judgments about anything the school is doing, or any evaluation of that. So we're not going to be giving you a judgment or saying that you haven't done something that you should have been doing. This is about gathering information. So the purpose of the visits is to really get a sense of exactly what's it like in schools in England at the moment. And we are uniquely placed to be able to do that, because we have that opportunity to visit any school across the country. And we'll be bringing together what we find from those visits to then publish that, not at school level, but at a national level, outlining to the Secretary of State, to others in education, to public and parents, what the situation is. And I'll touch on those a little bit later. As we move on to the next one, I guess this slide really is the essence of what I wanted to spend the majority of time on. What's the focus on the content of our visits? I've already said that we're not making judgments. We're not undertaking an inspection as such, where we will grade the school in any way, shape or form. What we want to be doing is having that collaborative conversation with you as leaders about these 5 areas, really. And I'll talk in a bit more detail about how you might want to consider organising the day that we come to visit. So we want to get a sense from you about what you see in your school are the barriers in managing the return to full education for all pupils. And already, even within Birmingham City, we've been to visit schools where, while they may be in postal codes very similar, there are very different issues that they're facing. Obviously, there's some similarity and commonality, but what we really want to do is to get a sense of what's happening for you in your school. What are the barriers to that return to full education? In terms of how learning is being resumed, so again, finding out from you what your plans about how you're helping pupils get back to normality as much as possible in terms of their learning, following what has been an extended period of disruption, whether they've been in school as part of key workers or vulnerable pupils, whether they've been accessing the remote learning that you've been providing. The difference, as you know only too well, when young people come back to school, we want to understand what the issues are that you're facing, what you have faced at the beginning of September, how things perhaps have changed, but also to identify what's gone really well. And in every school that we've visited so far, while leaders have been very clear about what the major issues are that they're facing, every school has talked about something that they will take, a positive thing they will take going forward, whether that's about their approach to the curriculum, whether that's about engagement with families, whether that's about the way they organise their school day. And again, we really want to be able to capture that information as well. In terms of how pupils are settling back into sort of routines and behaviour, so we'll want to know from you about how you've organized, if you've made any changes to the organization of your day, for example, your school day. Most schools have to some extent. And then any changes that you've made in terms of what your expected routines are. Have you had to make any adaptations? How have those gone? You know, some schools have talked about what they started in September and then they've adapted that. Again, we want to find out what's working there, as well as what the challenges that you've seen in terms of any aspects of pupils' behaviour when they've returned to school, any positives about that, but also any concerns and how you've managed to support them in their return to school. In this bit, we'll also ask around, I guess, attendance. So we're not going to be asking you for minutiae about attendance data, but a sense from you about what's attendance been like since the beginning of term until now, and how does that compare to this time last year? Are you seeing broadly similar? Are you seeing an increase? Are you seeing a decrease? Or is it very variable week to week? And again, a colleague just mentioned before the session started in full about pupils being sent home and staff. We also want to talk to you, I guess, about your view about specific issues in relation to pupils with special educational needs and/or disabilities, any adaptations that you're making to support those pupils, anything that you found that's worked really well, as well as health and well-being issues for pupils, and also what issues you're identifying, how you're supporting staff. And also about that aspect around safeguarding. I'll come on to that in a second. The safeguarding arrangements are very much in respect of how you're dealing with issues now in light of COVID-19, and I'll talk in a bit more detail in a minute about that. If we just stay on that one, sorry about that, but just in terms of to give you an idea of what the day might look like. We'll aim to arrive not before 10 o'clock unless you ask us to, and certainly be gone by 4 o'clock at the very latest. Lots of our visits are ending about 3, 3:15, although some schools, that's when pupils are leaving, so obviously we're not going to leave at the same time. We'll work with you in relation to that. What we'd like to do is to start really with a very general conversation, about 20-25 minutes, probably with head teacher, possibly another senior leader, on a very broad basis about what's been the impact of COVID-19 now. That could last the whole day, couldn't it? But it's really kind of broadly speaking, what would you say are the biggest impacts, both in terms of staff and staff well-being and issues around staff, and what are you finding? For example, you know, are there a number of staff who aren't able to come into school in person because they're self-isolating while waiting for tests, and so on and so forth? And any aspects that you've worked on that you think is really successful about staff well-being. Some of the schools that we visited have talked about actually a very different or an improved staff culture where staff have worked really well together and have been able to understand what everybody else is going through, and that's really helped us of collegiate view in the school. But also crucially, what are the barriers, what are the issues here in relation to staffing? So that context discussions broadly, what's been the impact on staff, on pupils, and then also what do you see, broad speaking, as your main priorities for the remainder of the academic year? And we'll probably then go on to ask you some more about that when we talk in more detail about the curriculum. Questions that I've been asked on sessions like this is who's going to be involved in those meetings, how are we going to make sure that we maintain social distance and so on. I think what's really important to stress is that these aren't inspections. We're not gathering evidence to then evaluate and make judgments. When I'm inspecting a school, I have a meeting with senior leaders, they tell me certain things, and then I will test that out by, for example, talking to other groups of staff, by looking at documents, by talking to pupils, talking to governors, and things like that. These visits aren't about that aspect of triangulation. So we're not going to be then testing out what you say. So if I just give you a sense of the visit that I led, most recent one I led, I spent the majority of the day with the executive principal and the principal. They brought in their safeguarding lead when we were talking about safeguarding, and then they asked me to meet with 3 curriculum leaders, and we went from their very big office to an even bigger room to enable that to happen. And that was all the staff that I met with. So what we're not expecting is to see is to have a large group of staff together, and of course you wouldn't necessarily want to be doing that anyway. So if I move on to, so the initial context, 25, 30 minutes, and we'd really appreciate that to be at the beginning of the visit. So, we arrive at 10 o'clock, we'll need some time to sort of get ourselves settled in, signed in, all of that kind of thing. And then 20 to 25 minutes on initial conversation. We're then going to have conversations with you about attendance, about behaviour, about safeguarding, and about curriculum. Now, the order in which those discussions happen is very much dependent on how you want to do that and how you feel best able to facilitate that. Some schools, it's worked well from talking about that context one into talking about behaviour. In other schools, they've wanted to be able to talk about curriculum first of all. So the inspector who's visiting your school would have a conversation with you about that. So it's entirely up to you how to organise that. What are we going to want to know around attendance? Bearing in mind, again, we're not going to be making any judgments on this. Really, what's the situation? How many kids have been able to come back full time? How have you managed that if you've been able to manage it? What are the issues around non-attendance at full time? What are the issues around pupils that have had to be sent home? What's been the situation, for example, since September? And how have you made any adaptations for any particular groups of pupils? For example, pupils with SEN, the harder to reach children, those that might have previously been persistently absent, and so on. And we'll also want to get a sense of how many pupils have left the school's role since September and also since March. So we've seen nationally an increase in parents asking for their children to be taught at home. Certainly in the city, that's increased quite substantially. So we're really wanting to be able to get a picture of that. In terms of behaviour, we'll be asking, how have pupils returned? How has it been? Has it been like you would expect it to be at the beginning of a normal term in terms of behaviour? Have things been better or worse? What have been the issues there? And what, has there been any impact on, has COVID had an impact on behaviour? And lots of colleagues have talked to us about newly vulnerable pupils and newly vulnerable families. So have you seen that manifesting itself in terms of behaviour? The curriculum discussion is probably going to be the longest discussion, so probably about 60 minutes. And what do we want to find out from you here? We want to get your sense of your timeline to return to the normal curriculum, so what you were doing at the beginning of March. DfE's expectation is that the normal curriculum will have returned by the summer term 2021. Most of the schools we visited so far have said that they're offering their full curriculum, but with adaptations. We're not going to draw a judgment on an evaluation of you about that. We just want to get a sense of where schools are, and then also what your plans are if you have made adaptations, or indeed you're not teaching some of your curriculum currently, what your plans are to return to that in line with the government's expectations. So linked to that, what's your situation in terms of breadth and balance at different key stages? So if you're in primary school, for example, lots of schools have talked to us about they've spent more time on reading than they normally would have done at this time of the year, because that's been something that they've really found that pupils have missed out on during lockdown and when they haven't been in school. Some secondary schools have talked about having to, make adaptations to, for example, in history, where it's maybe kids in year 11 who have done fine with sort of chronological knowledge and that kind of thing, but actually their skills of analysis haven't been able to be kept up as well as they would have done if they were being taught face to face. So they've made adaptations to their curriculum there. So what we really want to do is just get a sense of that. What's the picture in your school? And then we'll draw that together across all the schools that we're visiting. In secondary, Key Stage 3, ask you about, you know, your focus there in 7, 8 and 9. And then at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, in terms of exam subjects, have you paused any exam subjects? Have you made adaptations to it, and so on and so forth? We'll also ask about how you've identified any gaps in pupils' knowledge and skills. We're not asking for any documentation on this. We don't want to look at any spreadsheets. We don't want to look at any curriculum plans or anything like that. Just tell us about how you've done that. What has it told you? And then what are you doing about it? And linked to that, I guess, will be the whole focus on remote learning, whether that's online or a blended approach or paper-based and so on and so forth. And what will we want to know there? Probably about, you know, what have you learnt from having to provide some remote learning in the past? How have you adapted what you did perhaps in the spring and summer term for this term? Are you having to currently provide remote learning for groups of pupils? Are you offering some blended learning? So a number of schools have talked to us about actually one of the things that they'll probably change going forward as well is that there will be more of a access to an online platform, even if young people are in school. So some lessons may well have more of that than they would have done previously. And I guess one of the things we're trying to get a sense of is to what extent the remote learning, whether that's online or paper-based, how well that's aligned to your current curriculum. So the first set of schools we visited were in the second, third week of September, and they were talking about lots of things that they still wanted to do. So they had things in place if it was necessary for a year group to go home, but actually this wasn't something that was going to be, you know, immediately there and be perfect. It was something that they were going to be working on. And again, it's just to get a sense of how colleagues are working on that. I guess slight link to that will be, and linked to safeguarding, in how have you helped pupils to understand how to keep safe online? Have you involved parents with that? How have you made clear your expectations? How have you supported staff with that as well, so that they feel comfortable and confident to be presenting online, but also to make sure that things are safe? And really crucially, what are the barriers? Is it about digital poverty? Is it about a lack of resource? Is it about you know, families not understanding how to do it? All of those things I think are really crucial. And I'll come on to in a couple of minutes about what we found in our first set of visits around remote learning. If we move on to the next slide now, which is very much focused on safeguarding. So to reiterate, this isn't like an inspection. We're not going to be making a judgment on leadership and management, or indeed on safeguarding. What are we going to be asking you about? Those three words that are in bold there: identify, help, and manage. In light of COVID-19, how are you able to identify those pupils who are most at need? And what schools have told us so far is about the work that's been done in the spring and summer terms, particularly with some of the harder to reach families, that actually they've been able to, through either delivering food parcels to homes or delivering laptops or just having conversation about how things are going, it's actually resulted in a much better relationship between some families and school, which has enabled them to, school leaders, to identify when pupils might need help. Other colleagues have talked to us about, as I said earlier, the newly vulnerable pupils. So pupils who lived in families that previously never would have been a concern, but actually now are a concern because of all the issues that families have faced during the last few months. So how are you able to identify that through your staff training, through your contact with pupils, through your curriculum, for example, so that those that are at risk of harm can be helped, or those that have been harmed have been helped? And then moving into that aspect of help, how are you able to help those pupils in school through the work that you've already done and the work that you continue to do, but also when you've had to access any external agencies? And we'd like to know about things that have gone well in relation to that, as well as issues around access to external agencies. So again, we want to be able to refer to that and shine a light on what's gone well, as well as what the barriers are. And then also crucially, obviously, about managing safer recruitment and any allegations about adults. So lots of schools will have continued with recruitment because they needed staff in September. So how were you able to do that? And how have you made sure that all your staff are comfortable and are aware of what they need to do if they've got any concerns? We're not going to be looking at safeguarding policies. We're not going to be asking to look at personnel files and HR files and things like that we would do on an inspection. We will ask you to tell us about how many staff have started at your school since the last time the school was inspected. And then we'll ask for the names of those, and we'll simply sample the single central record. So it will be, so James McNeillie started in February 2020. I'll ask to see the single central record. We'll check that my name is on it, that the checks have been done, and that's that, and move on. If we identify or have serious concerns about the safety of children in the school, we would be bringing that to your attention very, very quickly, as you would imagine. And if it was a serious concern about children's safety now, or the potential risk that they have of serious harm as a result of something the school is doing or hasn't done, then we may need to inspect that school. We're not anticipating that happening very often, but if that was the case, then we would do that. And really that's a case of, if we cannot walk away from that school without saying there are serious concerns about safeguarding, then we would inspect the school. And I think most people and parents would expect us to do that. But we're anticipating that to be very rare. And in the hundreds that we've done so far, we haven't done that and hadn't need to do that. If we move on to the next slide now, thank you very much. Whoever's moving this on, it's almost like you're in the room, which is great. So just some further details. We're not requiring any pre-written planning or other documentation for the visit. If I say the visit that I led, I looked at no documentation before or during, because it's all about conversation. We didn't test things out, didn't look at any policies. I looked at the single central register. As I said, that's the only thing that I looked at. So what we're not asking for, if you say to me, well, actually, we've reshaped our curriculum and we're doing something different in year 7, I'm not going to ask to see any documents about that, because this isn't about an inspection. It isn't about testing that out. If you do provide us with any documents, we're not expecting that in any format. We're not going to be doing lesson visits as part of our visit. So we're not asking to see any lesson plans or any curriculum plans. And we're not planning to meet with the full range of stakeholders. So governors, local authority, multi-academy trust reps, trustees. We're not planning to have those discussions separately. I mean, some schools, for example, have asked for somebody from the multi-academy trust to be part of the conversations. That's absolutely fine. I've got no problem with that at all. But the questions we want to ask are about school level, not about sort of MAT level in that sense. A couple of times governors have wanted to have a separate conversation. If we can fit that in, ideally by telephone, then yes, we will do. But it's really about managing expectations here about this isn't an inspection. And I know I keep saying that, and you're probably thinking, oh, actually, it isn't by the back door. Absolutely promise you it isn't. Any of the evidence that we gather during these visits are not going to be used to inform the timing of the next inspection of the school, or not going to be used for key lines of inquiry for follow-up on any future inspection. So again, just getting that message to governor colleagues, I think is really important as well. And then on the next slide is about our letters. And so, as I say, some of you may have seen these because we've published them. A short letter to provide parents with information that says there about what you're doing to help pupils back into full-time education. It will say when the school opened to all pupils. It will say whether or not what your assessment is of attendance since the beginning of September and how it compares to the previous year. It will probably say about whether or not you're teaching your full curriculum and if not, what adaptations you've made, and whether or not you've got plans to return to those, to the full curriculum by summer 21. If I just give an example of a letter I read this morning from a primary school visit, they talked about the focus on reading and explained to parents why that was. They talked about actually they had to do some more work on number in particular, because that was what had been identified as a gap. And then we'll write about your plans for remote learning. So we'll comment whether or not you're having to currently provide remote learning, and what your plans are to ensure that all pupils get access to that. What they aren't going to be doing is making any evaluations. There's not going to be evaluative language in that. And as I said many times, we're not making judgments on that. There won't be any surprises in what's in that letter, because it will be based on what you have told us, but we'll still give that opportunity for a factual accuracy check, as we do with anything that we're going to publish at school level. And then from each individual school, we'll pull together sort of the aggregated insights and then publish briefings and reports, which are aimed at everybody in education and for the public and parents, but crucially for the Secretary of State and ministers, so that they have a true picture of what's happening in schools on a day-by-day basis, and also about how things might change. So we've published something based on September. We're pulling together the information through our October visits at the moment, which might mean that actually we shift our emphasis in terms of the information we'd want to gather from you, because things may have changed, or there may be other foci that we want to look at. In terms of findings from the pilot visits, now there is a caveat that all of these schools volunteered themselves, so it's with that caveat, of course. But what came out really, really strongly was the focus of how hard leaders had worked to make schools safe for pupils to come back in September, for pupils and for staff. I guess surprisingly, we found from those schools that in most of them, the attendance was back to normal. One of the visits I did, that the executive principal said she wasn't naive enough to think that when it gets cold and wet, there might be more children that are less likely to come into school. So she appreciated that. But what she drew on was actually attendance at her school was better than it normally is in September. And she felt that was because of the work that they'd done with families during lockdown, but also about how they'd explained to parents that this was a safe place for them. So they'd done, videos and blogs and all of that kind of thing. As I said earlier, most schools were teaching most of the subjects, but they had to reorder topics within subjects because of what was identified. I've referenced before about primary schools giving even more attention to reading than usual. And a number of the secondary schools commented about actually in year 7 and in year 8 that they felt that they had to do some more intervention work really with pupils around reading, less so on writing, but particularly on reading. And then on the next slide, again, just sort of summarizes some of the other aspects about remote learning being there. Most schools saying that they'd planned to return by summer 2021, but thought they would be able to achieve this earlier. And the biggest concern that came out, and I'm sure colleagues on this call will appreciate that, I know, was about concerns about not being able to keep schools open when staff had to self-isolate and the impact that that had. We also drew on the fact that many colleagues talked about guidance that was given wasn't as clear as it could have been, changed, and there were sometimes conflicting information given by national and local bodies and organisations. And actually that for some schools talked about that conflicting information was one of the reasons why a number of parents weren't sending their children back to school, because they were getting conflicting messages about whether or not it was safe in school. And then on the final slide for this really was this quote, which came out sort of over and over again really, about determination from leaders that they didn't want their pupils to be the COVID generation. And I guess that the link there was around the direct link to that was about the impact on staff in been doing this, and particularly the impact on head teachers who are having to make extremely difficult decisions on a daily basis about sending pupils home, not sending pupils home, sending staff home, not sending staff home. And one colleague that I spoke to talked about long gone were the days of strategic thinking. She was on the gate every morning, making sure that kids had their masks and they were keeping themselves socially distanced as much as possible. So those were the kind of broad findings that we found from those 120 odd schools that we visited, and my colleagues are currently pulling together the information from the visits since then until now, and we're aiming to publish the next briefing sort of early November, so not long after half term. That's the end of the presentation, and hopefully that's provided some reassurance about what we are doing and what we aren't doing. I'm really happy to take any questions from colleagues now. I know sometimes people think about things afterwards, and by all means email any questions either directly to me or to Carolyn, if you don't mind, Carolyn, and just sending them on, and I will absolutely get back to you on those. So yeah, over to really any questions or queries.
James, I've got a question about remote learning.
Sure.
Will you be looking at, because not just the setup and the systems and structures we're using, but also on the impact and the tracking?
So we'll ask you about what's your assessment of it. You know, what are you, what do you think? How are you trying to get some information about it? But we're not then going to say you've had a good impact or you haven't had a good enough impact, because I think the thing about remote learning, I'm sure colleagues are finding, is that what worked during spring and summer, and then when you're in a situation where you've got some kids in school in a year group perhaps, and then other kids at home, and that whole challenge around that, it makes it much more difficult to evaluate the impact. I'm pretty certain that would be the case. So it's, I guess, questions about how are you drawing that information? What's your assessment of it? Rather than us saying this is good, bad, or indifferent. We're not going to be doing that on these visits.
Do you think moving towards January, that would be more a focus with curriculum?
I think when we return to routine inspection and we're looking at curriculum in general, we will, because schools will be providing sort of remote learning in a way that is never done previously, then when we get back to making judgments about the quality of education, then we absolutely will need to take that into account. If I just give you a sense of what we're doing around that, the department wants to know about, the Department for Education wants to get a real sense of what's happening with remote learning. So we are providing them with information from our visits, not on a school by school basis, but about, so what's working well, what isn't working well from what head teachers are saying, what are the barriers around this, and then what are the implications for government in terms of how they can support and help schools further in relation to that. And then when it comes to us returning to routine inspection, excuse me, then what we want to be able to do is draw on all of the information that we've gathered through these visits to get a sense of what it's really like, because we haven't done, as you know, we haven't done this kind of work before in terms of inspection, and lots of schools won't have done that. So we need to know what a baseline might be, but we won't be doing that in September. Sorry, we're not in September anymore, in October, November and December.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else? Anthony.
Hi, James.
Hi there.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I thought I'd lost you for a second. Firstly, congratulations on your post.
Thank you.
It gives me a lot of confidence, actually. I thought that was really eloquent and professional, the presentation, as always.
Thanks.
I mean, we go back a while, but I do that. But mine's more of a comment than a question. I've written down 4 words, actually, that I think we've gone through, and most schools have gone through. We've gone through an evolution.
Yep.
And incrementally, a lot of what you were talking about curriculum, what's happened is there's been growing confidence. And so, for instance, the curriculum here is more or less, apart from drama and music, almost back online. But that didn't start like that in September, or indeed, but really from September. But over the course of weeks as we've gone through this, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about remote learning too. And there is a cycle of growth, and it's really quite strange because we're at such an embryonic level in some of those areas that, in a way, what you've talked about makes much more sense now for you to come in. And I know, obviously, you did the pilot, but we're much further down the line if you know where or what I'm saying. So I think that visits are obviously they're part of your job and important. But for the schools, I think we've gone through this cycle of evolving incrementally, becoming maybe more confident to deliver things in a more normal way than we were maybe back in June.
I think that's really important for us to hear, and I'm sure other colleagues are going to tell us that, Anthony, because it is about that aspect, isn't it? About, you know, it's the kind of, everybody wants the gold standard and they want the gold standard immediately, but actually it takes some time to get there, doesn't it? And it is about, I'm sure you've had to do a lot in terms of helping your staff, in terms of understanding the most effective ways to deliver online learning. And I just at this point, I saw something in one of my friends I do have a friend who's a teacher, who head teacher, he emailed me a link to a course about what Ofsted expects on online learning. And please don't spend any money on that, because whoever's delivering that has got no idea what it is, because they don't work for us. And I'm telling you what our situation is in terms of finding things out about online learning. So yeah, that's useful to hear, Anthony. Thank you. And the evolution, I'm sure, is the same in lots of ways that you're working, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just, I mean, the strangest thing, to be honest, is, you know, you know, the normal routines of school become actually pretty embedded into everything you do, and to be thrown into almost a spin because you're having to learn things. I mean, it's like now, I can't tell you how difficult it is for me using these screens, but
yes,
that's just another way in which we just have to adapt.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, I did it, just talking of adaptations. I did something like this yesterday in the car on my way back from a school. You know, it's just because these things, you know, it just, everything's changing, isn't it? Everything's changing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jane.
Any other questions from anybody?
Can I just get a sense from colleagues about their views about us returning to inspection in January? Any thoughts, views? Please be as honest as you can be.
James, are you still hear me?
I can, yeah.
Yeah. Here we go. Straight away. Don't do it. I think what you're doing at the moment is the right thing. I think inspecting schools, and by the way, you and Dan most probably look up my scores anyway, because you can't help it. Like I look up everybody else's. Okay, but I'd like an inspection at the moment with plus 0.51 GCSE and plus 0.54 A level. I'd love it. But my advice would be not to. People are under massive stress. Teachers are under massive stress. The teachers are running around like never before. I feel for them. You know, I mean, I think, you know, my job is sort of like so much more remote in the sense of, you know, I'm not having to run to the classes, carrying books and everything else. I'm not sure that it will do you much PR in visiting schools. I think the thing has to settle down. And the reason also I'm saying that is I think that this is going to get much worse before it gets better. There's some feedback for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just add to that, James?
Of course.
I've only been head of school for about a year now. And last year, we did an awful lot of work on curriculum, depth and breadth. I mean, you know, with the new Ofsted framework, I felt we got to a point where we'd got a really robust curriculum, depth, breadth, a lot. We're all through school, linking it to our primary. And since coming back in September, it's not that all the good work's unravelled. It's certainly not the case. We've tried to return to normality as much as possible. In fact, we haven't reduced our curriculum offer at all. But it's just every time you think you're getting somewhere, you've got like 2 weeks consistent teaching, all of a sudden a year group, you've got 2 classes out, or you've got 4 teachers out. And so I don't think I've had 1 week where I can say, everybody could say that everything was running smoothly, consistently. There's been interruptions each week, and every interruption has been different. And that obviously then impacts on that seamless evolution of the curriculum as the academic year goes by. You know, we're doing our best to close gaps. We've done CATS tests, we've done baseline testing. But then, you know, sometimes you've got several kids in, several kids out. It's like colleague has just said, I'd be really fearful of Ofsted walking in from January and trying to actually have a real hold on what the big picture is. Every week, like today, there's only 2 SLT out of 8 of us. I dealt with 2 COVID cases yesterday. I had to cancel my diary. Luckily, I've not been interrupted yet. I've switched my camera back on, but you just don't know what you can expect each day. And I'm sure colleagues in this meeting have probably gone through similar experiences. I come into work and I don't know how the day is going to pan out. So, like you said, that strategic thinking, you do end up, I mean, I have been on the gate for an hour this morning already. You know, I think we would be worried. I like the approach you've got to visits. I don't know whether some of that approach of being like a critical friend as opposed to an inspector would support in January if you do decide or it does go ahead. It's a bit of a blended model, like we're doing blended teaching.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I just want to add that I reiterate everything you've just said. It's every day in school is different and very stressful in different ways. But I think what we'd underestimated is the level of anxiety that the staff would be feeling. So we were all, obviously before coming back, we were all prepared and ready for children's well-being and getting mental health provision in place and everything else. And we have obviously looked after our staff as best as we can. But what we're sensing is that there's real anxiety. I mean, we've got staff that are, you know, on stress risk assessments and worried about teaching classes because they were classed as vulnerable, but now that classification has gone, they're not, you know, they're very, very worried about being in school and teaching their classes. So we're having to deal with that. Then we've got people who are just completely exhausted, and exhausted not from the physical, it's just the whole kind of school day is not a normal school day. So the level of anxiety that staff are feeling is very tangible, especially now that we're close to the half term. So if inspections would start in January, I don't know really how people would respond to that, and I think it might push us over the edge. But yeah, that's my view on it, really.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think, you know, we what it would look like, I think, is part of what our discussions are internally at the moment, because returning to what we were doing at the end of February in January, or whenever we do return, it's not going to be exactly the same, because it can't be. But no, it's really useful to get people's perspectives there. I think somebody's put a question.
So it's Nikki from she's the executive head at the Titan Education Trust. She can't speak on the microphone, but they're a free school alternative provision. They've moved forward to offering postcode gang school refusers online live lessons. Is Ofsted now accepting this as appropriate?
So I guess what we would do on these visits is ask about what your rationale behind it is, and about how you know what's your assessment of how well that's working. DfE's expectations are that pupils are back in school and are attending and are given a broad curriculum with the return to their normal curriculum from summer 2021. I do know that there are there are schools that are offering young people who won't come into school online lessons because it's still giving them their education. There are other schools that I've spoken to, and leaders have said that they're not doing that because this is potentially lining up a long-term issue with parents not willing to send their children into school, or children not willing to come into school. I appreciate, Nikki, that your situation is pretty unique. At this moment in time, we don't have a view on it. And be really, I know that sounds like a bit of a politician's answer there, but at the moment we're simply wanting to find out what's happening in relation to what's working best for you and what the challenges are. I think Nikki's just added something else in. They're sitting live in class, just online, so they can't interact with teachers in class. It's for safeguarding. And again, that's, you know, looking at the situation going forward. How tenable is this going forward? How secure can that be going forward, that those young people are as safe as they possibly can be? I guess those would be the kind of questions that we would be asking when we return to routine inspection. It's not the type of thing, if we came to visit your school, that we would be pushing you on at the moment. It would be asking about how you're managing this at this period of time. And I think, you know, once we get into the point of returning to routine inspection, then, you know, we would be clear about what that is. Because part of what we're doing in these visits is finding out exactly what the situation is and how best we can manage it.
Thank you, James. So a final opportunity, we're just coming up to 11 o'clock. Final opportunity for any last questions? No, I think if any of you do, if you do have questions, just as James alluded to, please do email Sarah, and she will forward them on to James, who will pop back to respond to those. I'd just like to take this opportunity, James, to say thank you very much. We had hoped a few more were coming along, quite a number more had committed, but as Anne has alluded to this morning,
of course,
just things happen completely, you know, without, you know, knowing that things are going to take place. So we're just happy that you were able to come along and stay, and thank you to James. That's been very helpful. So Huda, thank you. You've just expressed that exactly. Good to see you all. I hope you managed to have a fabulous, relaxing, restful half term. I can't say how much you deserve it. My goodness,
absolutely.
I hope you managed to do that. And we will catch up at the other side of the half term break.
Thanks very much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you for your
Keep
time,
safe.
everybody.